Lecture 8, Motivational Considerations. What motivates you to seek out new learning experiences? Why do some people seem to tackle assignments head-on and truly master content, while others struggle to do the bare minimum? What causes some people to disengage and give up in the face of challenges, whereas others persevere and try harder? None of these questions have simple answers. All of us are motivated by a variety of factors, some of which are internal, like the inherent joy of mastering a new skill. And some of these factors are more external, such as wanting to receive recognition or wanting more money. And of course, our motives often vary from one moment to the next or across domains. For instance, what motivates you to go to school might be different from what motivates you to go to work. And what motivates you in one course or for one assignment might depend on the content or the way it's presented, or the extent to which it resonates with you at that particular moment in your life. Have you ever reread a book from your youth only to find yourself relating to it in a very different way? Or have you ever been surprised to find yourself riveted by a lecture or a TED Talk on some topic that you didn't even realize you were interested in? Or on a topic that you used to find boring or uninteresting? Our motives are complicated. No two people are exactly alike, and no one person is motivated in the same way or by the same things across all situations. Yet motivation is an important precursor to effective learning. Motivation predicts how you engage with the learning process and what efforts you put forward. Our learning strategies are important, but even if you know what the best learning strategies are, it won't matter unless you're motivated to actually use them. And though we often focus on external sources of motivation, like promises of rewards or threats of punishments, some of the most powerful influences on motivation come from within. Our motivation, learning behaviors, and ultimately successes and failures are very much predicted by our own beliefs, for better or worse. The good news is that these beliefs are malleable and we do have some control over them. In this lecture, I'll identify 3 major cognitive influences on your approach to learning: achievement goals, expectations, and mindsets. For each one, I'll encourage you to reflect on your own ways of thinking and responding in different situations, and then I'll describe what the research says about how those beliefs are likely to impact your behaviors. Towards the end, I'll offer some suggestions for how you can monitor and adjust your beliefs to optimize your motivation for learning. To start, I have another question I'd like you to consider. If you had a choice between taking 2 versions of the same course, one that was guaranteed to be an easy A, that you could complete with little effort or thought, or a different version that was guaranteed to be challenging, but offered greater opportunity for learning, which would you choose? Don't think about it too hard. Just go with your gut. Motivational theorists have identified 2 major types of achievement goals: mastery goals and performance goals. Mastery goals are when you're focused on improving skill and increasing your knowledge or understanding. And, as the name implies, performance goals are when you're more focused on demonstrating your ability compared to others, or achieving outcomes like good grades or recognition. Now, most of us hold a combination of mastery and performance goals. We want to learn and grow for our own development, but we also want to ensure that we're meeting external standards. And whether we like it or not, performance standards are quite common in society, and we are often judged against others. So neither goal is inherently good or bad, or right or wrong, but the extent to which you value one over the other can dramatically affect your behaviors in learning, especially in the long run. What research shows us is that people who prioritize mastery goals are more likely to seek out and enjoy challenges because they're perceived as being useful and necessary for learning. They're also more intrinsically motivated and self-driven, and thus less dependent on other people to motivate them to achieve. In addition, because they're mostly focused on personal growth, people who value mastery goals are more likely to use deep processing strategies, to persist when they encounter difficulties, to learn from their mistakes, and to feel more satisfaction with their work. On the other hand, people who prioritize performance goals are more interested in the outcome as opposed to the process of learning itself, and are thus more likely to take the path of least resistance. They tend to experience anxiety on challenging tasks and often act in ways that interfere with long-term learning and memory, such as cheating, taking shortcuts, and using superficial learning strategies, and even avoiding challenging learning opportunities from the start. In other words, people who prioritize performance goals are often willing to sacrifice their own learning for the sake of performance. It's more about the grade than the personal gain, more about the show than the substance. With that being said, performance goals are not always problematic, especially when we live in a society that often glorifies competition and places high value on things like standardized test scores and rank. It would be unfair and unwise of me to suggest that performance doesn't matter or that you shouldn't care about your performance. Researchers have also distinguished between different types of performance goals that have different effects. Performance approach goals are when you're motivated to outperform others and are more focused on attaining positive outcomes and recognition. Performance avoidant goals, on the other hand, are when you just don't want to fail or appear stupid to others. It's basically the difference between setting the performance bar high and setting the bar very low. And research has consistently shown that performance avoidant goals are the most likely to negatively impact learning and performance. When you set the bar low to begin with, you leave little room for error. People with performance avoidant goals are the least likely to persist through challenges and often engage in avoidant behaviors, like not asking for help for fear of looking stupid. People with performance avoidant goals are also more likely to self-handicap, which basically means that they create excuses for themselves as a way of saving face. For example, you might procrastinate on completing a project until the last minute, stay out late, or prioritize other things. So when you don't perform well, you have a convenient excuse or can blame other factors besides your own ability. To someone with performance avoidant goals, it's better not to try and then fail than it is to try and risk failing. And in some ways, that highlights the paradox of performance avoidant goals. The extreme fear of failure, the focus on not looking bad, actually leads to behaviors that increase the likelihood of failure. It's a hard cycle to break. The research on performance approach goals, however, suggests that they're two-sided. Aiming for high performance can be beneficial when it motivates you to exert a lot of effort and to persist. And high achievement is certainly rewarded by society. But those goals can easily backfire and turn into performance avoidant goals when you're not successful. Why keep trying if you're not getting the praise and recognition you most crave? Competition and negative self-comparisons can also make you lose interest in activities that you otherwise used to enjoy. In addition, if the competition level is low, or if you've opted to stick with a familiar task, setting a performance approach goal may cause you to limit your own potential. Having performance approach goals might actually keep you in the rut of the familiar, rather than motivating you to explore potentially challenging opportunities for growth. So, at the end of the day, it's important for you to reflect on your own values and to set goals accordingly, being sure to consider the likely short and long-term consequences. Having performance goals isn't inherently bad, and research indicates that having a combination of mastery goals and performance approach goals might actually be most advantageous for academic achievement. But performance is not a perfect predictor of actual learning or growth, and prioritizing performance over learning makes you more vulnerable to setbacks and less likely to learn to your full potential. It's also valuable to keep in mind that prioritizing mastery goals usually leads to high performance anyways. When you really care about your own understanding and growth, you're more likely to engage and to think deeply about what you're doing, to persist through challenges, to learn from your mistakes, and to carry those knowledge and skills with you long term. At this point, you may be wondering what would lead people to prioritize performance goals over mastery goals in the first place. There's really no simple answer to that question. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes it comes as a result of external social pressures from parents, bosses, coaches, and so on. As much as you might want to be mastery-oriented, at the end of the day, it's performance that ultimately dictates whether or not you get that degree, promotion, praise, or opportunity. And not all performance measures actually require or even reflect true mastery. So if mastery isn't encouraged or reinforced, then it's easy to get preoccupied with performance. Another factor is time. Again, as much as you might want to engage with deep learning strategies, sometimes it's hard to do when you're simultaneously burdened by other courses, assignments, and obligations. Sometimes we take shortcuts out of necessity or merely as a way of getting by, especially when we don't control the timetable. Sometimes our environments just aren't very supportive of mastery learning. But there are other internal factors that influence our achievement goals too. For instance, your own interest in the task or subject. You're much more likely to focus on mastery when it's something you enjoy, or when you perceive the information or skill to be personally relevant and valuable. In contrast, you're more likely to set performance goals when you perceive the task to be merely a means to an end, or an obstacle to overcome, or just part of a checklist. So the same person who focuses on mastery in one area, say psychology, might focus on performance in another, say math. Okay, so far we've been talking about how achievement goals can influence your approach to learning. Another major predictor of learning behaviors are your expectations for success. Expectations can be divided into two parts, self-efficacy and outcome expectations. Self-efficacy refers to your belief about whether you are capable of carrying out a specific task or performing a behavior. And an outcome expectation is your belief that your efforts will actually lead to desired outcomes. Both expectations are domain-specific. You can have high self-efficacy in one area and low self-efficacy in another. For instance, my efficacy for psychology is high, but my efficacy for car mechanics is relatively low. You may also believe that your efforts will have more or less of an effect in specific situations. For instance, you may believe that one instructor evaluates students consistently and fairly, and another instructor is biased. These subjective expectations may or may not reflect reality, but they still have a tremendous impact on your behaviors. The effects of our expectations on our motivation and learning may seem obvious. If you don't believe you can do something or that your efforts will make a difference, then you're less likely to pursue that goal in the first place or to persist in the face of challenges. You're also more likely to set performance avoidant goals. If, however, you believe you can achieve something, then you're more likely to set mastery or performance approach goals. There's a point at which having too much self-efficacy can be detrimental. For instance, overconfidence may discourage you from focusing on the task at hand and may therefore cause you to make mistakes or otherwise miss important information. But for the most part, having high efficacy is beneficial to achievement because it motivates you to initiate effort and to keep going even when things get tough. It's like the popular children's book, The Little Engine That Could. Remember? I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. When you have higher positive expectations, you're more likely to persist and to try different strategies, and therefore you're more likely to succeed, which in turn helps you feel even more confident the next time you engage in a similar task. Like a self-fulfilling prophecy, high expectations tend to have a positive, cyclic effect on achievement. Our expectations often become our reality. But the opposite is also true. If a person's self-efficacy is very low, or if they believe that their efforts won't matter, then they may be at risk of developing something called learned helplessness, which is a pattern of indifference and apathy. Learned helplessness was originally studied in a lab by a behavioral psychologist named Martin Seligman in the 1970s. His research involved putting animals, most famously dogs, into situations that they couldn't control and then observing the effects on their later behavior. So, for example, in the first part of the study, dogs were placed in a cage and received shocks that they couldn't avoid, no matter how much they tried. Then, in a later phase of the study, the conditions were changed so that all the dogs had to do to escape the shocks was to move to the other side of the cage. But in the second phase, most of the dogs didn't move at all. They learned to be helpless. In people, low efficacy or a lack of perceived control over outcomes leads to lower effort, which increases the likelihood of failure. And repeat failures lead to lower efficacy and a stronger sense of helplessness, which becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. Instead of exerting more effort or trying something different when failure occurs, someone with learned helplessness is likely to give up and explain away their failures by saying something like, I just can't do this, or I'm stupid, or I never will perform well, so there's no point in trying anyways. As Henry Ford once said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. It's normal and healthy to doubt yourself from time to time, but you have to be careful not to let those doubts stop you from trying, even if you are really bad at something. If you give up before you even try, then the only thing you're doing is guaranteeing failure. Having high self-efficacy doesn't mean you think reaching a goal or accomplishing a task will be easy. It just means that you think it's possible. And that brings me to another belief that influences learning, mindset, or your belief about the nature of intelligence or ability itself. As I described back in Lecture 1, some people believe that ability is something innate and unchanging. Either you're born with it or not, and there's not much you can do about it. This is known as a fixed mindset. But research says that the most successful people, when it comes to learning and performance, hold growth mindsets, where they believe that ability and intelligence are built or developed over time through effort and practice. Not surprisingly, people with growth mindsets tend to be motivated by mastery goals aimed at growth and improvement, and they engage in behaviors that promote mastery, such as using deep processing strategies, making efforts to learn from their mistakes, and persisting in problem solving when faced with challenges. People with fixed mindsets are more likely to prioritize performance goals, and the likelihood of them holding performance approach versus performance avoidant goals is based on whether they believe they have the innate ability. When they believe they have the ability for a particular task or subject, they're more likely to hold performance approach goals. But if they believe they lack the ability, then they set performance avoidant goals. As an example, if you have a fixed mindset and you don't think you're creative or artistic, but you have to take an art class, then your goal will most likely to be simply to get through it without failing. But if you have a fixed mindset and you happen to believe that you are naturally creative or artistic, then you're more likely to want and expect to perform well in that required art class. But either way, when you hold a fixed mindset, you're more likely to avoid challenges and to give up when you encounter difficulties. Why would you persist if you think ability is something that's fixed and unchanging? To someone with a fixed mindset, challenges signify a lack of ability, a dead end. So they prefer to stick to subjects that are easy and familiar. Having a fixed mindset also causes you to act in ways that limit your potential for growth and learning. No one is inherently good at everything, and even people who are born with natural talents still need to exert effort to improve. Olympic athletes might be born with certain genetic or physical characteristics that are advantageous to certain sports, but they don't become Olympic athletes by sitting on the sidelines and taking it easy. They work their butts off and continually stretch their own limits. Just because you won the genetic lottery doesn't mean you will be automatically successful. Just as inheriting a learning disability doesn't preclude anyone from developing their skills and knowledge with the right kind of effort and support. You might not ever rise to the intelligence level of Stephen Hawking or become as skilled a soccer player as Mia Hamm or as great a musician as Yo-Yo Ma, but that doesn't mean that you can't improve or that you shouldn't try. The most pernicious limits are those that we unknowingly impose on ourselves. When we go into learning situations with performance goals, low expectations, and fixed mindsets, we actually set ourselves up for difficulties. Fortunately, these motivational goals and beliefs are malleable. Research shows, for example, that parents and instructors can encourage students to hold more mastery goals, high expectations, and growth mindsets by recognizing effort and praising individual progress and growth. But regardless of the environment in which you find yourself, there are also things that you can do to enhance your own motivation and learning. So what are the key takeaways? First, deliberately aim for mastery over performance. This doesn't mean that you should discount performance feedback altogether, but it does mean that you should focus more on tracking your own progress, efforts, and growth, as opposed to how you compare to others. Doing so will help you persist when you encounter challenges, will increase your enjoyment of learning, and will ultimately make your accomplishments feel inherently more satisfying. Instead of wasting your time with easy tasks or shallow memorization efforts, challenge yourself and use deep processing strategies that help you understand and internalize what you're learning. And keep in mind, people who are more mastery goal-oriented tend to perform highly anyways, especially long-term, even though performance itself isn't their focus. Thus, aiming for mastery will help you succeed relative to external standards as well, kind of like a 2-for-1. Another tip to enhance your motivation is to try to find personal relevance in what you're learning. This might be easier said than done when, say, you're completing a required course outside of your major or a mandatory training at work. But if you go into a learning experience with an open mind, or with the intent to find something useful or relatable, then you're more likely to have that happen. Remember that our expectations have a tendency to become self-fulfilling. And that brings me to a third suggestion, which is to carefully monitor your own thinking and to catch yourself when you start to doubt your abilities. Don't let your inner critic become your worst enemy. Speak to yourself the same way that you would speak to a friend who's feeling discouraged or who's doubting themselves. Talk back to the pessimistic voice in your head. Try to turn that negative self-talk into positive self-talk. For instance, if you find yourself thinking, I can't do this, change it to, I can't do this yet. Or if you find yourself thinking, this is too hard, change it to, this will take some time and effort. Or this is hard, but I can do it, or I can get some help. And remind yourself of successes that you've had in the past, or with other times that you persevered. In short, try to be your own coach or cheerleader. My fourth piece of advice is to take responsibility for your own learning. Attributions are the stories we tell about the causes of our successes and failures. Like expectations, attributions are subjective and may or may not reflect reality. And they may or may not be genuine. Sometimes we truly believe them, and other times we present them as mere excuses to save face or to protect our egos. The same attribution, like being ill or tired, may be completely legitimate in one situation, but nothing more than a convenient excuse in another. The truth is, lots of things have the potential to impact our learning. Everything from ability to effort to health status to distractions in the room to the way the instructor teaches to sheer luck. It's often hard to pinpoint the exact causes of our successes and failures, even when we try. And we're not completely responsible for our learning. Stuff happens, and situations vary from one context to the next. But it's helpful to look at patterns in the kinds of attributions you make. If you routinely attribute success and failure to things like innate ability or luck or other factors outside of your control, then you're effectively giving up, and your motivation and achievement will be at the whim of others. But if you choose to focus on things you can control, like your own efforts and strategies, then you can more effectively direct your own learning, including making adjustments after failures that will increase your chances of success the next time. Lastly, try to change your view of failure and how you respond to it. See the good in the bad. No one likes to fail, and it sure doesn't feel good. But failures provide additional opportunities to learn and grow. Instead of viewing them as final statements on your ability or worth, try to think of them as temporary obstacles or stepping stones toward further growth. The experience of failure itself is not a perfect predictor of long-term success. In fact, the most successful people in any field usually have long lists of failures. The important part, and what makes successful people so successful, is that they learn how to overcome and recover from setbacks. And that's not something you have to do completely on your own. Instead of feeling embarrassed or defensive, seek out feedback, constructive criticism, and advice from trusted sources. Asking for help is not a weakness, and it's often necessary to have an outside perspective or the experience of someone more advanced to shed light on where and how to change. In conclusion, it's important to remember that our beliefs are developed through a lifetime of experiences. We have reasons for holding certain goals and expectations and mindsets, and so it's unreasonable to assume that they will change instantaneously. Like behavioral habits, mental habits take time and effort to break. But the more you can learn to recognize your own ways of thinking, and the more you understand how your beliefs influence your behaviors, the more you can modify them to be more conducive to learning. We don't have complete control over our motivational states, but there are strategies you can employ to enhance your own motivation, which can increase your use of effective learning strategies and ultimately your chances of success and well-being.